Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The voice that comes from the empty grave. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Past Comes Calling. Chicago's streets hummed with the low grumble of early morning traffic. Caleb Reed sat in his cramped apartment, staring at the empty page on his laptop screen. The cursor blinked accusingly, matching the rhythm of his growing frustration. 15 years as a journalist, and now he couldn't string together a single compelling sentence. A half-empty coffee mug sat beside a stack of rejection letters, each more polite than the last. His editor's voice echoed in his head, "Find something that cuts, Caleb, or find another job." But inspiration eluded him. Instead, the same nightmare replayed in his mind: damp earth, a cold breeze, and a voice calling his name from the shadows of a cemetery. A sharp knock at the door jolted him back to reality. He hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be his landlord demanding rent. Instead, he found a small, weathered envelope with no return address resting on the welcome mat. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore his estranged father's unmistakable handwriting. "Caleb, it's happening again. You need to come home before it's too late." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father, a man he hadn't spoken to in over a decade, had always been prone to cryptic warnings. Caleb's first instinct was to crumple the note and toss it, but something about the desperate tone lingered in his mind. By noon, he was behind the wheel of his aging sedan, the Chicago skyline shrinking in his rearview mirror. The highways blurred into long stretches of flat farmland and skeletal trees, the kind of landscapes that made time feel heavy. Caleb tried to distract himself with the radio, flipping through static-filled stations, but unease crept in when an all-too-familiar sound crackled through the speakers. "Why did you leave me?" Caleb's foot slammed the brake, the car jerking to a halt in the middle of the empty road. His chest tightened as he fumbled with the dial. The voice, soft, broken, and disturbingly familiar, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. It had been years since he'd heard that voice. Years since the bet, the cemetery, and the unmarked grave. He looked at the dashboard clock. 3:33 p.m., a time that seemed ordinary to most, but to Caleb, it felt like a warning. Gritting his teeth, he forced the car back into motion, the voice still echoing in his mind. The letter, the voice, whatever awaited him in his hometown, it wasn't just his father's warning pulling him back. It was something far darker, something he thought he'd left buried in the past. Chapter 2. The Hometown Shadows. The Welcome to Fairhaven sign creaked on rusted hinges as Caleb's car passed beneath it. A shiver ran down his spine as he took in the sight of his childhood town. What had once been a modest but lively community now resembled a ghost town. Shops along Main Street were shuttered, their close signs covered in dust. The few pedestrians he spotted walked with hurried steps, heads down, as if avoiding being noticed. Caleb parked outside his father's house, a sagging two-story relic with peeling paint and overgrown weeds clawing at the porch. The air was thick with decay, and the silence pressed against his ears. He stepped inside, the musty smell of neglect hitting him like a physical blow. The living room was cluttered with newspapers, stacks of books, and loose papers scattered across every surface. His father had always been a pack rat, but this felt different, chaotic, desperate. On the kitchen table, a sealed manila envelope bore his name in bold, shaky letters. He hesitated before opening it, his pulse quickening. Inside were a set of keys and a brief, scrawled note. "Caleb, if you're reading this, I am gone. The truth is in the study. Gone? His father had been dead for 3 weeks. Heart failure, the obituary said, but the uneasy feeling in Caleb's gut told him there was more to the story. Upstairs, the study was a disorganized labyrinth of papers and notebooks. Among the clutter, Caleb found a battered tape recorder with a cassette already loaded. Static hissed from the speakers when he pressed play, but faint whispers broke through the noise, too garbled to understand. As he rewound the tape, Caleb found a notebook detailing his father's investigation into a series of disappearances spanning decades. Each case was tied to the cemetery people who vanished without a trace, their last known locations marked with ominous precision. Caleb's stomach churned as he flipped through page after page of frantic notes, drawings of grave markers, and grainy photos of the unmarked grave. The whispers on the tape recorder grew louder, forming fragmented words that made Caleb's blood run cold. You shouldn't have left. The notebook slipped from his hands, the room suddenly colder. Caleb wasn't just uncovering his father's obsession. He was stepping into the very darkness that had swallowed him whole. Chapter 3, Whispers in the Dark. The whispers began that first night. Caleb lay on the worn couch in the living room, the faint hum of the tape recorder still playing in the study upstairs. Static leaked through the floorboards, like a persistent reminder he couldn't shake. The air in the house felt heavier, suffocating, as though the walls themselves held their breath. At first, the whispers were distant, barely audible over the creaks of the old house. But as the night deepened, they grew clearer. "Why did you leave?" the voice murmured, soft as a breeze, but laced with accusation. Caleb bolted upright, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the shadows, pooling the corners of the room. They seemed to thicken, shift, and stretch toward him when he wasn't looking directly at them. He flicked on the lamp, flooding the room with weak yellow light. The shadows stilled, but his unease lingered. Sleep was impossible, yet exhaustion dragged him under some time before dawn. His dreams were vivid and visceral. He was in the cemetery again, his hands clutching a rusted shovel. Each strike of the blade into the soil felt like a heartbeat, pulsing through his chest. He dug feverishly, dirt flying as if he were desperate to uncover something buried, something waiting. When he woke, his fingers were caked with dirt, the metallic scent of earth clinging to his skin. He sat up abruptly, his pulse pounding as he examined his hands. Had it been real? The couch cushions beneath him bore faint smudges of dirt, as though they too were part of the dream he couldn't explain. Determined to find answers, Caleb returned to the study. Among the chaos of his father's belongings, he unearthed a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. The entries were scattered and fragmented, much like the thoughts they recorded. His father's scribbled notes led him to a folded map tucked between the pages. The map was of the cemetery. Red ink marked several burial sites, but one stood out, a circle drawn with heavy strokes around the unmarked grave from Caleb's childhood. The sight of it sent a chill racing down his spine. Caleb clutched the journal, flipping through the remaining pages. The entries described nightmares identical to his own visions of digging, voices calling, and hands that moved dirt with frantic purpose. His father had been consumed by the same darkness, the same whispers. As the static from the recorder above grew louder, Caleb realized the line between reality and nightmare was beginning to blur. And the house, like the grave, was keeping secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to uncover. Chapter 4. The Grave's Secret. The map felt heavier in Caleb's pocket as he stepped into the cemetery that night. The place hadn't changed much since his childhood, though time had made it somehow colder, more foreboding. Moonlight cut through the thin fog, casting long, jagged shadows from the weathered headstones. His breath clouded in the chilly air, and each step felt like walking into the past, a past he wasn't sure he wanted to revisit. He stopped in front of the unmarked grave, the circled site from the map. The earth looked undisturbed, yet it seemed to hum with energy, a silent pulse Caleb could feel in his bones. He crouched, brushing away leaves scattered across the ground. "Margaret Hayes," he whispered, recalling the name scrawled in his father's journal. A few hours earlier, he'd scoured the town's crumbling records at the library, finding fragmented stories of her trial. Accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s, Margaret had been ostracized by the townsfolk. Her death was marked not by justice, but by vengeance. The records ended abruptly, as though someone had tried to erase her existence. "Help me." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, weaving through the trees, curling in his ears. Caleb froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" he called, his voice louder than he intended. Silence. Then it came again, louder, this time, clearer. "Help me, free me." The voice was undeniably feminine, soft yet strained, as if it had carried through centuries to reach him. Caleb's legs refused to move, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. "Margaret?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Cold wind swirled around him, whipping leaves into the air. For a fleeting moment, he swore he saw her, a pale figure standing just beyond the grave. Her face was indistinct, but her hollow eyes bored into his. "They buried me with their sins," she said, her voice fractured, desperate. "Dig, and I'll be free. But there's always a price." The apparition vanished, leaving Caleb alone in the oppressive silence. He stared at the ground, his mind racing. If Margaret's spirit was trapped, was freeing her the right thing to do? And what price would she demand? He knelt, his fingers brushing the earth. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like the cold night air. One action could unearth the truth or awaken something far worse. For now, he left the grave untouched, but the question haunted him as he walked away. Was Margaret the victim or the monster? Chapter 5. The Price of Answers. The morning sun did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep into Caleb's bones. Sleep had eluded him once again, his mind replaying Margaret's fractured words. "There's always a price." The weight of her warning hung heavy as he flipped through his father's journal over a lukewarm cup of coffee. The entries grew more unhinged as they approached the end. Scrawled notes hinted at a curse, not just on Margaret, but on the entire town. Caleb read aloud. Fairhaven wasn't built, it was bought. Blood for land, silence for prosperity. His father's words felt like a riddle, each sentence raising more questions than it answered. When the knock came at the door, Caleb nearly dropped his mug. Heart pounding, he hesitated before opening it, half expecting a neighbor, or, worse, the sheriff. Instead, there was no one. Only the faintest scent of his father's aftershave lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of his presence. "Dad?" Caleb whispered, stepping onto the porch. The street was empty, but as he turned back inside, a figure stood at the end of the hall. His father dressed in the same tattered flannel he'd been buried in. "Dad," Caleb's voice broke, his throat tightening. "You need to finish it," the figure said, his tone flat but insistent. "You're the only one who can." Before Caleb could respond, the apparition dissolved like smoke in the wind. His legs felt like lead as he sank onto the couch, the journal still clutched in his hands. But it wasn't over. That night, as the fog rolled in thick across the town, Caleb saw her. Elise, his ex-girlfriend. She stood outside the house, her face pale, her eyes wide with sorrow. "Caleb," she called softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "Why didn't you stay? Why did you let me go?" He blinked, and she was gone. By now, Margaret's whispers had grown louder, and her words became more coherent. She spoke of a curse that tainted the town of men who had sacrificed her to bury their sins, of a cycle of blood and betrayal. "Your family knew, Caleb," she whispered one night, her voice slithering from the corners of his mind. "You're tied to this, bound by the choices of your bloodline." The townsfolk had begun to notice Caleb's presence. Their sideways glances turned to outright hostility, their whispers growing louder in the streets. "You should leave while you can," a hunched old man muttered as Caleb passed the general store. But Caleb knew it was too late for that. Whatever this was, it wasn't letting him go. And worse, it seemed the town didn't want him to uncover the truth. Chapter 6: Descent into Madness. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, staring at his trembling hands. They still felt the weight of unseen soil, the phantom sensation of dirt caking beneath his fingernails. He hadn't been to the cemetery that night, yet his dreams had taken him there again, digging furiously, the whispers growing louder with each shovelful. He could still hear them, lingering in his ears, long after he woke. "You can't escape this," Margaret's voice cooed, a mixture of seduction and menace. The house itself seemed alive now, its creaks and groans less like an old building settling and more like a deliberate presence. Shadows moved in the corners, even in the daylight. His reflection in the cracked hallway mirror flickered when he looked away, his own face momentarily replaced by Margaret's hollow-eyed visage. He opened his father's journal again, desperate for answers. The scrawled entries felt more like ramblings of a man unraveling. Phrases like "she is in my mind" and "the soil screams when I dig" mirrored the horrors Caleb was experiencing. A chill ran down his spine as he read. "She doesn't need chains. She binds with guilt and feeds on fear. The more you fear, the stronger she becomes." That night, sleep refused to come. Caleb stayed on the couch, clutching his flashlight and his father's journal like lifelines. But the dreams found him anyway. He was in the ground, his arms pinned at his sides, the weight of dirt pressing down on his chest. He screamed, but no sound came. Darkness closed in, and all he could hear was Margaret's laughter, hollow and cruel. When he jolted awake, his chest heaved like he'd been holding his breath for hours. His phone's clock read 3:12 a.m., but time felt meaningless. Driven by desperation, he threw on his coat and made his way to the cemetery. The caretaker's shack was a dimly lit relic of the past, reeking of stale tobacco and damp earth. Caretaker, a wiry man with sunken cheeks and piercing eyes, opened the door a crack, his expression wary. "She chose you, didn't she?" The man rasped, his voice tinged with both fear and pity. "What are you talking about?" Caleb demanded, holding up the journal. "Why is this happening to me?" Caretaker sighed, stepping back to let him inside. "Margaret feeds on guilt and fear. She finds someone tied to the sins of this place. Someone like you. Your father tried to stop her, but he couldn't. She made him see things, horrors that weren't real, but felt real enough to destroy him." Caleb's stomach churned. "Why me? What does she want?" "To come back," the caretaker said grimly. "She needs a vessel. And you're perfect for her." Chapter 7: Digging the Truth. Caleb's mind churned with the caretaker's words as he stood in the cemetery, the night air thick with unease. The moon hung high, casting eerie shadows across the graveyard. But it wasn't the moonlight that chilled him. It was the growing sense of inevitability, like he was walking toward a precipice from which there would be no return. He gripped the shovel tight, his hands slick with sweat, despite the cold. The cemetery was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of wind that seemed to whisper his name. Margaret's presence was everywhere. He could feel her watching him, her eyes boring into his back even when he wasn't looking. "Tonight, it ends," Caleb muttered to himself, half to steady his resolve, half to break the silence that seemed to press down on him like a weight. With each thrust of the shovel, the earth beneath him felt colder, more resistant, as if the ground itself was rejecting him. The whispers grew louder, then faded, only to return, now mingled with voices he hadn't heard in years. "Caleb," his father's voice called softly, filled with desperation. "Don't do this." His mother's voice followed, then Elise's, both twisted with pain and sorrow. "You shouldn't have come back." The air turned frigid as the wind howled around him, tearing at his clothes. It felt as if the very ground was alive, pulling him down, urging him to stop. But Caleb didn't. He dug harder, the earth giving way reluctantly as the grave deepened. And then the air turned still, deathly still. Caleb's shovel hit something hard. His breath caught. He leaned over the grave, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The surface of the coffin was old, weathered, yet still intact. The moment he placed his hands on it, a cold, icy jolt shot through his spine, and Margaret's voice ripped through the silence, now clearer than ever. "Foolish boy." He recoiled as a figure began to rise from the grave, her form shrouded in mist. At first, it was only a wisp, but then Margaret materialized fully, her ghostly form floating above the ground, her eyes burning with a malevolent fire. "You think you can stop me?" she sneered. "You who are bound by the same bloodline. You who carry their sins." Caleb backed away, his chest tight with fear, yet he stood his ground. "I'm ending this, Margaret." Her laugh was a low, guttural sound. "You think you can end it? You're a part of it. This town, my death, the curse, you are the key. But there's always a price to pay." Caleb's mind raced, the weight of her words sinking in. Curse wasn't just about her. It was about everything, about the sins of the past, his own family's role in it. And now, it was about him. Margaret's voice softened, but the malice remained. "You'll break it, but it will cost you. Your life or the one you love most." The truth hit him like a punch. The cost was far greater than he'd ever imagined. Chapter 8: The Final Choice. Cold wind howled, and Caleb stood in the moonlight, face to face with Margaret's vengeful spirit. Her eyes gleamed with malicious triumph. The air around them crackled with raw power. He could feel the curse tightening its grip on him, every second drawing him closer to the brink. His heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of inevitability. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "Your life or the one you love most." "I'm the last one left," Caleb said, voice hoarse, his throat dry. His mind was racing. He thought of his father, of the toll this place had taken on every soul who had ever lived here. He thought of the lives lost, of the town's suffering. He thought of Elise, of the promise he'd made to return, never realizing the cost would be this high. "I'll sacrifice myself," he said, the words heavy in the air. Margaret's laughter swirled around him like a whispering wind, bitter and cold. "You think that will stop me? You think you can end this?" Her voice twisted with dark amusement. "Foolish boy, you're nothing but a pawn. This cycle, this curse was never meant to end with you. You're just a piece of the puzzle." But Caleb didn't hesitate. The weight of his family's sins, the generations of silence, the years of pain, all pointed to one conclusion. He could end this. He had to. "I'm ending it," he said, more to himself than to her. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the shovel that still lay next to the grave. The ground beneath him seemed to pull, urging him back, but Caleb pressed on. This was the only way to break the cycle. This was the only way to stop her from continuing her torment. He positioned himself in the grave, closing his eyes and let the weight of the earth press down on him. As he began to bury himself, the cold, suffocating earth filling the air around him, Margaret's voice began to fade, growing softer and softer. "No, please." Caleb's breath caught as the final remnants of his air dwindled away. He thought the curse was finally breaking, the end of his torment. But then, through the suffocating silence, a new realization struck him. His heart skipped. The whispers of the town, of the lost souls, had not ceased. Margaret's voice, faint but still lingering, whispered one last time. "You think you end it, Caleb? You only transfer it." With a final, sharp breath, Caleb realized what he had done. He had sacrificed himself, but the curse had not been broken. It had only been passed to someone else. The earth settled. The winds died down. The town fell silent.